Hey, Drew here, and I have to say, I have, for the most part, the feeling that this episode of The Stand, this is the second to the last episode entitled The Stand, I have to feel, for the most part, that this was kind of a hot mess. It wasn't a complete waste of time for me, but I feel like they significantly undercut any good elements with two aspects that I will bring up. First, I feel that, when you hear this story brought up, people bring up the fact that it's kind of like Lord of the Rings in a post-pandemic landscape. It's this battle between good and evil. And I think that if you read enough of the interviews of the people that were creating this show and the behind-the-scenes people, that they were really, really uncomfortable with that. I think that they thought the idea of good versus evil is just too Ronald Reagan, it's too George W. Bush, it's too old school. And that nowadays we realize that everyone is kind of gray and there is no good and there is no evil and everyone's kind of somewhere in between, which is fine. I kind of get where they're coming from in that regard. I think that it's not good to view the people that you're facing in a war as purely evil. But come on, if you're looking at this story, the people of New Vegas, they're evil. I don't think there's another word to describe them. Sure, maybe there's a couple people that aren't that bad stuck in the mix, but they literally have a murder pit in the middle of their orgy zone. And they've crucified all these people, as Ray points out to Glenn, and they're following Randall Flagg into all this wicked behavior. So if you don't call them evil, I don't know who you can call evil. Second, I feel that a lot of the dramatic moments in this episode, Nadine's death, Glenn's death, other moments, they were undercut severely by these campy decisions that showed to me that the people who created the show just didn't trust the audience to take this seriously, so they decided to contrast the earnestness of certain moments with this campy tone where they could kind of be winking at the audience and saying, isn't this kind of comically ridiculous in the tragic moments? And to me, that was just a mistake. You kind of had to pick a tone here, and I think that this has been a problem throughout the show, but it was particularly a problem in this episode. Breaking down the key moments in this episode. First, there was Glenn's death. And I have to say, Greg Kinnear, he did a great job from an acting perspective. I thought that this moment was perhaps a little hard to swallow. I feel like a person in Glenn's situation would be more frightened than he was acting. And I think that it would have been more dramatically powerful to be showing him be frightened as he faces his imminent death. But I did admire the way that this scene played out, and I liked how he struck at the heart of Randall Flagg's power over these people, which is the fear that he uses to motivate them. And they kind of showed how the minute the people's fear of him starts to dissipate, he starts to lose his power as he kind of falls to the floor of his room in his Las Vegas penthouse. An issue I had, I don't think they've really shown this fear as a motivator throughout the show. They've shown Randall Flagg be scary in some moments, but contrast the way that Randall Flagg is portrayed in this miniseries with the way he's portrayed in the book, where people are literally frightened to get drunk and to do other substances because they might mess up and then they'll get killed by Randall Flagg. You don't see that here. I think that clearly the showrunners thought that they would go for this hedonistic atmosphere, but I don't think that that really works on the whole because it doesn't really seem like they're afraid of Randall Flagg. It seems like they're just enjoying being his followers because of the opportunities he lets them have to do what they want to do. Anyways, there was a lot of mixed messaging on what New Vegas represents to these individuals. But again, I feel like this moment from Glenn's perspective was strong. I thought that Greg Kinnear's acting was good, the way that he struck at the heart of Randall Flagg and died on his own terms. I thought this was well developed. Now, I will grant you, I did not buy this at all from Lloyd's perspective, and I'll talk more about Lloyd later, but I felt that they tried to redeem him this episode, but to me it kind of felt like trying to redeem Kylo Ren after episode 7. He's just killing Glenn was a bridge too far, and the fact that he didn't even have Randall Flagg forcing him to do it, that he kind of did it on his own initiative, for whatever his reasons were, to me, it's just something you can't come back from. And it's a little bit hard for me to swallow that he was really that torn about this. He's been with Randall Flagg so long, it's really hard to believe that he hasn't participated in worse things than simply shooting a man. And the crowd's reactions to this, too, just seemed to me kind of odd. It was like, really? You have a murder pit. Do you really find one guy getting shot a bunch of times, do you really find that upsetting? Is this really causing you to reevaluate your relationship with Randall Flagg? That was tough for me to swallow. I talked about how the campy elements of this show kind of undercut a lot of the dramatic moments. I thought that was true with Glenn's death somewhat, the way that Rat Lady was acting during the trial with having that real hammer instead of a judge's gavel, and her entire costume. I think it just kind of was so distracting that it was hard to take the scene entirely seriously at a dramatic level. But I thought that this was even worse in the way that they handled Nadine's death. Now, granted, I think that this is probably a hard character for a lot of people to watch, not the least of which because it's portrayed by the somewhat controversial actress Amber Heard. A lot of people really hate her. I'm not going to get into that. I'm only here to talk about this show. But needless to say, this character is someone that blew people up and has really, gone over to the dark side. And it's hard to imagine her trying to turn around, but she does just that here, in that she kind of dies on her own terms when she realizes what her allegiance to Randall Flagg has cost her, and the fact that he doesn't really care about her except as a vessel for bringing his dark and evil child into the world. And this moment where she bursts through the glass and falls to her death, courageously killing herself to stop this child from being born, going out on her own terms, there's dramatic weight there. But then they undercut it with just the overall campy tone of the scene, the way that they had Randall Flagg there, sitting there in his, silk bathrobe and smoking a cigar. It was really, really excessively campy. And then to cap it off with the cherry on top was the line that he said right after she fell. He does a couple howls, which is Alexander Skarsgard doing his dramatic acting moment. And then he turns to Lloyd and says, "Cancel the nursery." And that was just so campy that it completely undid any dramatic value that this scene had. And to me, it was just a poor decision on the writer's part. Now let's talk about the climax of this episode, which, I was disappointed by this climax in the book. I was expecting, the forces of good to amass and the forces of evil to join together and everybody to come together in this massive conflict, because that's what Lord of the Rings is. And if this was going to be Lord of the Rings in a post-pandemic landscape, then that's what you would expect. But the book was fairly anticlimactic in the way that this bomb goes off and kills everyone. And as I've gotten older, I think I've kind of come to terms with this ending, realizing that it's kind of showing how evil sows the seeds of its own demise and it's kind of wiped out in a flash. And even though Larry and Ray and all these other characters, what they did and their eventual demise may have seemed unnecessary, that if you believe in a higher power, you could argue that he used them, that he used their sacrifice to bring about the circumstances necessary for this to happen, even though they didn't realize that that was how they were being used. And it was, very hard for them to go into this situation. And, I really liked the way that Jovan, Adepo, and Irene Bedard played these scenes. I feel like they weakened the character of Ray because they had Irene Bedard playing her and they wanted to make Larry stronger so that he could comfort this character who was a woman. And to me, you can disagree with me. Sometimes women will be the weaker character in a situation like this, but I feel like to do it this way, it just struck me as a little bit sexist. But putting that aside, I really did think that Irene Bedard's performance was phenomenal here, the way she expressed her lines. I think she did a fantastic job. And the moment when Larry, carried forward that theme of I will fear no evil, and he started quoting that psalm, and then people in the crowd started, to repeat what he had said. I've never heard of a lynch mob identifying with the person that they were lynching, so I found this a little hard to swallow. But on an emotional level, it really just struck me deeply, and I actually ended up tearing up quite a bit during this scene. But again, then they undercut it with the campiness of this scene. And I think that, like I said, in the book, it was very anticlimactic, but it did accomplish a certain purpose. It showed evil being snuffed out like a candle, just like in a flash. And that's kind of a brilliant way to do it if you don't want to fall into cliche and have a Wheel of Time style battle between good and evil at the end. But to me, the way that they did it here was like the worst of both worlds, because they, instead of having it be this act that you could kind of view as an act of God, or you could kind of say, well, maybe there's a natural explanation for this, they had this bright, shining thing come down and start shooting lightning in all directions. So it seems like clearly to be supernatural interference. You can't really explain this naturally in any way, so you have to assume that it was some kind of divine intervention. And then on top of that, it was kind of like, I think that they just thought the climax would be too short if they just had the bomb go off, so they had it shooting lightning everywhere and killing everyone, and it was this really prolonged sequence, much more prolonged than it was in the book. And to me, this was just a mistake. I think you either needed to do what King did in the novel and have everyone be wiped out in a flash, or you needed to have a completely different ending where it was actually a confrontation between good and evil. I don't think that this in-between thing worked. I think that they didn't want the audience to be disappointed, so they tried to prolong the climax, but it just didn't really add much. They had some gory deaths, people getting struck by lightning. Again, I did not buy Lloyd's decision to turn away from Randall Flagg here, especially after they've conveyed very, very clearly that he's afraid of Randall Flagg, and there's just no reason for him not to be afraid of Randall Flagg here. And again, the people in the crowd identifying with Larry and Ray just didn't really make sense. I mean, one second they're dancing around and, being jubilant in these people that they are going to participate in their execution, in their murder. And then the next second, there's suddenly some people in the crowd that are like shouting, hey, I will fear no evil, identifying with them and being beaten as a result. I just didn't buy it. I get it from a symbolic perspective that people standing up to evil can cause other people to stand with them. But from an actual story perspective, from something that was taking place within the show, it just didn't seem believable to me. And again, the moment when the bomb goes off, they clearly sunk a lot of money into the show. The special effects were pretty good, and the moment where the bomb went off was pretty good. But overall, I just felt like this sequence, it simultaneously contained all the elements that I found disappointing in the novel, and also added new elements where it was taking away from, what the novel managed to accomplish. So to me, it was like a double fail in that regard. So next week, I'm not really sure what to expect. Obviously, this was the climax of the story, and everything after this is kind of an epilogue. So I'm curious to see what they do in this coda that Stephen King has penned, where supposedly it's going to be different than the novel in some regards. I'm not sure how different. I have to imagine it's going to be pretty much the same for the most part. But overall, like I said, there were two main flaws with this episode. I feel like they undercut the dramatic moments with the campiness, and they refused to commit to portraying it as a struggle between good and evil, which to me just made it not as compelling. It made the sacrifices of Larry and Glenn and Ray not as compelling because they chose to not view it as a sacrifice in the battle versus evil. And I really think that they needed to commit more to following through on the themes that King had in his novel. So those are just my thoughts for what they are worth. Obviously, I could have brought up the lack of character development and how that made some of these moments not as impactful as they were in the novel, but I would just be beating a dead horse with that criticism, so I'm not going to make it. But let me know what you thought of this episode. Let me know if you enjoyed it more than I did, if you think I'm right about what was wrong with it. If you're excited to see this new ending, let me know your thoughts. And if you're interested in seeing my reviews of upcoming shows, such as the sequel to The Silence of the Lambs, Clarice, on CBS All Access, or The Luminaries on Starz, please consider subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching.